Welcome to our event for October, which is campaigning for the climate. Um, the elections being uppermost in many people's minds at the moment. I'm Reinmar Zeidler, member of the steering committee for New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. And this event is partly a follow-up to our statewide summit, Keep New Hampshire Green, which we held in Plymouth at the end of August. And at that event, we wanted to focus mostly on broader issues, not the election specifically. But at this point, the elections are approaching rapidly, and so we want to talk about things that we can do in the next month to bring and keep environmental issues at the top of the priority list for as many voters as possible. So our concern here is not so much with specific races or with specific candidates, as it is with putting environmental issues, keeping environmental issues uppermost in voters' minds. Um, and From what I've read, it seems that Helene and now Milton down in the Gulf may be actually changing some conversations at a national level and hopefully in New Hampshire as well. So first off, let's remember that this event takes place in Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge with gratitude the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout the generations. And secondly, a reminder that this event is being recorded, and anybody or everyone who's registered will receive a link to the recording when it's ready. And now I'm going to turn the proceedings over to my esteemed colleague, John Gage, who will introduce our guest speakers and lead the ensuing discussion. John, after his successful career as a software engineer with Oracle, John Gage retired a few years ago for the best possible reason, to work on helping to forestall and prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Today, he leads the New Hampshire chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby and has been spearheading New Hampshire Network's climate working group. John, do you have everybody that you need on board now?
I believe we do.
Excellent. Take it away.
Yes, we do. There she is. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, so much for joining us tonight. And thank you, Reinmar. That was a very nice introduction. So we've been talking about how to get environmental voters to the poll booths for months now. The network has had 3 events, and we thought it's really heating up, and we should try to get some experts who actually know what they're talking about campaigning and their experiences working with the voting public about the campaign cycle and basically raising the importance of climate and environmental issues and how voters make their choices, and also how elected leaders rate the importance of legislative efforts to address the problems. And we're focusing on the climate tonight. So I've been heading up to the State House for about 7 years now, every once in a while, to testify in committee hearings for bills. And I just been working with my own town's state legislators. And I want to give you 2 stories that kind of highlight the importance of talking to your own town state reps and senator about your concern about climate change. The first was last election cycle. We had a new Republican who was campaigning on really caring about the environment. I went to visit her at an event with my daughter, and we talked about our concern about climate change, what we do volunteering to try to get carbon fee and dividend legislation passed at the federal level, and how New Hampshire should prepare for a federal carbon price by doing all the right things in New Hampshire. And that basically means investing in energy efficiency, electrifying transportation and heating, and deploying clean energy solutions and not fossil fuel energy infrastructure. So right before the election, all the candidates appeared on a candidates night, and somebody asked a question related to climate, which I was very happy to hear. But when it came to this representative's turn to talk about climate, they said, well, in all my campaigning, I only heard two people say anything about climate change. And so I'm focusing on education, blah, 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 blah. And that was, I don't think that was the most politically astute thing to say, because you shouldn't ever kind of downplay a voter's concerns, even if you only heard it once. But it was also a window into what moves elected officials into doing things for their town. We need more than one or two people talking to state representatives about climate to get them to care. Now, it's a scientifically identified problem. It shouldn't be a political issue, but obviously the fossil fuel industry has made it a political issue. Funding front groups that spin misinformation, funding candidates who will deny the science or ridicule the potential policies to address the pollution problem. And so in New Hampshire, there's heavy influential front groups. The second anecdote or second story I have, though, is with another Republican from Windham, representative, who has been a friend for 20 years. And I started talking about climate with him several years ago. And he actually agreed to co-sponsor a bill to do a study on what would happen to New Hampshire of a federal carbon fee and dividend legislation. So I really appreciated this. He's really sticking his neck out. But then it became very difficult to get in touch with him before the hearing, and I wasn't able to reach him until recently. But it turns out when it came to a full House floor vote, he voted against the bill that he had co-sponsored. And this is, I'm inferring, due to pressure from his party about you vote how we want you to vote on these bills that we care about, and we will support you on the things that you really personally care about. And climate and energy was not his area. And so I understood politically why he kind of felt that he couldn't even vote for his own bill. But again, it sends the message. I think in New Hampshire, we need to talk, especially independents and Republican voters need to talk to Republican candidates about this problem to try to get some alignment, bipartisan alignment on doing something for climate. So that's my take. I'm from Windham. It's a Republican town, and all of our state legislators are Republican. I'm trying to make headway every year, talking politely with them, and I think they're starting to understand the problem, but they're still not voting the way that I would like to see them vote. So anyway, we brought two experts in this with real experience, and hopefully we've allowed enough time after all of our Zoom problems to hear them say what they want to say. Representative Rebecca McWilliams is an attorney, uh, and an environmentalist, and I believe an architect. Did I read also? That's impressive. She's been in the New Hampshire State Legislature for 6 years, and has some interesting things to say about the campaign cycle and talking about the environment with voters and how voters can help make a difference. So thank you very much, Representative McWilliams, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, John, for the invitation, and thank you to the New Hampshire Network. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Representative Rebecca McWilliams. I represent South Concord, and I also have the distinct pleasure of hosting the State House within one of my districts. I'm an at-large rep, so I cover 4 different wards. So it's always fun to talk to the folks in the State House, both my colleagues and lobbyists and the public, about what's going on in each of their districts, and of course, bringing it all back to Concord. because we have a lot of overlap on the issues. So specifically, John had asked me to kind of talk a little bit about what it means from a political campaign perspective when you are trying to bird dog or work with someone who is running for office within your district, and you have the opportunity to speak with them either one-on-one or to ask a question at a public forum. I think that everything that John said is really true about what politicians and specifically what candidates are paying attention to. So just to put this in perspective from sort of my own 2 cents, I became involved as a state representative 6 years ago because I am an environmental activist. I wanted to do something about the coal power plant in Bow. I didn't want my kids to be breathing in crappy coal-filled air. And I felt as though getting involved as a state representative would be a good way to start pushing for policy that was green, environmental, and hopefully alternatives to fossil fuels for the state of New Hampshire. So as an architect, I've been working for the last 25 years to reduce carbon emissions in buildings. I believe in zero net energy buildings. The International Building Code is moving to zero net energy as of 2030. So it's really important for politicians to adopt current codes. We can talk about that later and why New Hampshire won't update the latest energy code. There are a lot of political pieces to that. But big picture, considering that buildings are 30% of our carbon emissions, we really ought to be reducing that to zero to the extent that we can as soon as possible. So when it comes to politicking, one of the things that I discovered knocking doors and talking to my constituents is that the wallet issues, the checkbook issues, the money issues are really where people are at most of the time. I would say in this election, in this news cycle, there are some other newsworthy issues that definitely have broken through and become sort of top issues, but people are still worried about an economy that works for all. And so that's really where I'm able to meet people, especially independents, Republicans who are open-minded. I myself am a Democrat, but I work across the aisle and I pass bills with anybody who will work with me. So when I'm talking to folks, it's really about finding common ground. So when you're talking to a politician, you may not want to come at it and say something super flashpoint controversial as the first thing out of your mouth. So just as an example, and I'm going to say this as a fairly liberal Democrat, I would not knock a door of an independent or a centrist-leaning Republican and say women's rights are my #1 issue. I know it's going to turn them off. So if you're lobbying a politician who may not align with your own values and your own party, you really don't want to lead with something that's super controversial. And I would say women's rights in New Hampshire has been a flashpoint. So I would not start with that because it's going to be something where you're already starting to find some friction. Instead, I would lead with, I'm really concerned about the changing weather patterns in our state. We've seen a lot more flooding and droughts, and I'm concerned about our state's resilience. Resilience is a great word. And I use resilience because it means different things to different people. So for example, when we talk resilience, we may be talking about sea level rise, increased storms, hurricanes, flooding, everything that happens along the seacoast, lack of the ability to get insurance, property values, people losing their life savings and their homes to changing weather. Those are all really good things to talk about because those are pocketbook issues. People have examples of knowing somebody who's been impacted by flooding. We've also had some major flooding on some of our rivers as well on the Vermont-New Hampshire border. And just in general, we've had some significant droughts for people who are in ag. So it feels like there are a lot of stories and things that we can draw from to talk about, well, what is that resilience that New Hampshire needs in order to combat the changing weather? And notice I didn't really say the words climate change. Climate change is another flashpoint. I would not start out with saying the word climate change because you're going to turn off half your audience. So you want to be really careful to say changing weather patterns, increase in floods, increase in droughts, even increase, we're starting to see more microbursts and little tornadoes, which we haven't historically had quite so many of in the past, and it's becoming more frequent in New Hampshire. So that again leads to our concerns about resiliency. So what does that mean? That could be increasing our building codes to address structural concerns and issues with higher wind, right? Hurricanes, tornadoes. That could also be updating our flood maps. We're hearing, at least in the news right now, when people talk about these 100-year storms happening every year, guess what? Our terminology is outdated. We should not say 100-year storm anymore. That just means a 1 in 100 chance of a storm. So we're talking about 1% storms rather than 100-year storms. We need to update our terminology about that and say, okay, there's been an uptick in frequency. So now this is more like a 25% storm rather than a 100-year storm or 1 in 100-year storm. So all of those things are to say you want to be really careful about the words that you use when you're posing a question and when you're starting a conversation with someone who's either running for the first time, running for re-election, wants to be a politician, and may come to the table with some predisposed notions already. You want to be really careful how you approach it and don't turn them off in the first couple of sentences as you begin the dialogue. Another thing that's really important is follow-up. So after having a conversation with someone and saying, hey, I'm really concerned about resilience, it's really important that you get their contact information and that you send a follow-up email. You can also probably Google them and follow up through social media. A message on any social media platform would probably be acceptable as well in this day and time if you can't get their email address. But most of the email addresses for all of the email addresses for our currently elected officials are available online. So if they're a new candidate, you'd have to find them through socials or just ask them, hey, how can I best contact you? So that's the part where you form the relationship with the elected official. And I have to stress this, having been in office for 6 years and having served on science, technology, and energy for that amount of time, I really do have certain folks that are either constituents, lobbyists, or just regulars who I email with about specific topics. And so you become a trusted resource, someone who shows up whenever we're talking about, in my case, I've really been championing 5 megawatts of net metering for all. So every time I'm having net metering conversations, it's the same folks that I'm bringing to testify, bringing to speak about it, have similar opinions, and we're able to talk about it, but also bring the business case, right? So Anheuser-Busch, which is typically a fairly conservative business, has been a huge advocate for increasing net metering for all because they're actually losing money consistently with not having the ability to net meter 5 megawatts of solar on the rooftop of their facility. If they could, it would change a huge amount of money that they're spending on electricity that they're being forced to because they can't net meter the extent that they'd like to right now. So again, it's about becoming a trusted resource, creating a relationship. When you're bird dogging and you're doing something at a forum, I also want to really point out that this is not about getting likes on your social media. This isn't about flashpoint. I just want to have a zippy response and retort. You really do want to ask a thoughtful question that deserves a thoughtful answer, because we're really looking to see that politicians are thinking about the issues of changing climate and what policies would make sense for New Hampshire to respond to that sort of thing. Another thing that we've talked a lot about on science, technology, and energy is along the resilience front, the fact that our utilities in New Hampshire don't actually produce energy, right? So Eversource, our biggest utility, is actually in the business of transmission lines, and they get paid for transmission of electricity, and then they flow through whoever your actual energy source is. If you purchase private energy, it's coming through your bill. If you decide to go with the base rate, standard rate, that's coming through your bill, but Eversource is going out to bid every 6 months to get that from other sources. If you're getting community power, which is fairly new and exciting, again, it's really about transmission and setting up grids. So long-term, I just want folks to know that when New Hampshire commits to future plans for where will our transmission grid be upgraded, things like Northern Pass, right? And also, where are we going to have resiliency, redundancy, battery backup, some kind of additional support for when major storms happen? That's something that politicians are really interested to hear from constituents about. And that's not something that a lot of people have been bringing forward. I'm seeing it more from the lobbying front than constituents. And I know that everybody here has been through a power outage because we live in New Hampshire, right? At some point, a tree goes down and you lose power. So it's okay to bring that up with your electeds or soon to be electeds and say, what is your plan for New Hampshire when we have another blackout this winter for 2 or 3 days? What is your plan? Because obviously the plan right now is everybody's on their own, every man or woman for themselves, get a generator, figure it out, go to a friend's house, get a hotel. There's always like this sort of individualistic piece, and that's very New Hampshire. But big picture, we're seeing across the country, stuff like in Texas, where the grid went down and it's completely disconnected from the overall US grid. So if they wanted to secede, maybe they could. But Texas is actually moving to connect their grid now because they're realizing the go it alone method doesn't really work. So New Hampshire is part of the greater New England grid, but we still do have these times where we lose power, and that's part of resiliency, is coming up with a plan. I would pitch the idea of microgrids. If you're talking to some politicians who understand microgrids, I would just float that. Microgrids are bipartisan. It is not a red-blue issue. Resiliency and having the ability to connect a microgrid to support something like your local hospital is a good thing for everyone. Because then if you need to have somebody who always has to have oxygen, you're not relying on diesel and a generator and potentially a backup generator when the first generator goes down. Hospitals actually deal with this quite often on a campus. So microgrids, again, is a good thing to talk about. And I've made some progress with Majority Leader Jason Osborne on microgrids because he's actually very interested in shared combined resources in co-op housing type situations. So it's interesting to find some areas of perhaps we can talk about having some solar for co-op housing and microgrids so that it can function autonomously when the power goes out and Eversource is out. So those are some suggestions and ideas that I just want to bring up and bring to thought about being careful and thoughtful on your lobbying, bird dogging, creating relationships with electeds and soon to be electeds. I just want to conclude with a personal story. It's a little sad, it's a little bittersweet, but it's true. Having been an avid environmentalist and advocate for energy and climate and the environment in New Hampshire for the last 6 years, I was really excited to announce my campaign for Senate earlier this summer. And we ran an awesome race, three-way race for Senate in Concord. Lost the first place slot by only 300 votes. It was super close. But here's the bittersweet part. I went through my Rolodex and I called every single person, organization, lobbyist, constituent, everybody I know in the climate and energy front. And I said, this is a big deal. You want to have somebody who's fighting for the environment as your senator. And I will tell you that it was a real challenge to get people to donate to climate champions. And this is coming from somebody who's dyed in the wool. I've done the work. It was really hard to get donations, and money talks. So I will tell you that on other fronts, things like women's rights, public education, I could make that pitch and get a donation. But for some reason, climate, it was like pulling teeth to ask for money. So I will challenge you here in this room, since I've got nothing to lose now. Please donate to people who are actually climate champions and really support their campaigns, because the stakes are so high. And when they don't make it, we all lose. So I'll leave you with that. And I'm happy to answer questions later, but I think I'll pass it back to John.
Thank you so much, Representative McWilliams. That's great insight. And I think all of us are probably getting ready to spend some money as soon as this ends, because that's we really loved having you in Concord, and we want to keep our champions there. And there are dozens of climate and environment champions in the State House, and we really do need to support the ones that keep doing the right things. So to our next climate champion, Representative Nick Germana is a professor of history at Keene State College, and he's also a member of the Environment and Agriculture Committee, whose duties include the protection of the state's environment from forms of pollution other than air or water pollution. So I would assume that also includes climate pollution. I was lucky enough to meet him last year at the New Hampshire Network's summit, and we joined the climate group discussion group, and had a nice talk afterwards. I believe that's where oh yeah, I think he was in the same group. Yes, he was. Thank you. And then we struck up a conversation about proxy carbon pricing, which is one of my favorite little avenues. This is a way for the state to anticipate a future federal carbon price in the decisions they make now, so that we don't get stuck with obsolete fossil fuel infrastructure later. It would make the state invest more heavily in energy efficiency, electrification of building heating equipment, and transportation. Anyway, it was a wonderful conversation, and I was very grateful for him for the conversation and the bill. And I think, these are the kind of people that it's just wonderful to work with in the State House. And so really excited to hear from him tonight. Thank you very much, Representative Germana, for joining us.
Thank you, John. I've appreciated working with you, and know that we'll be working together again in the future. So some of you here, I can see we're at the recent climate summit up in Plymouth. So you've heard more or less what I'm about to say. What I'm going to talk about for a few minutes tonight is how we can kind of together, legislators and activists, work together successfully toward our common goals. And some of what I've learned, and I'm just finishing up my first term, running for my second term, but the example that I'm going to talk about for a few minutes has to do with solid waste issues, which is kind of the area that I've focused on environment and agriculture. As I'm sure everybody here knows, about half of what we put into our landfills here in New Hampshire comes from out of state. There are regulations in the states around us regarding particular kind of PFAS-rich materials that are not landfilled in Maine or Massachusetts or Vermont, but we have landfill rules that are about 30 years out of date, and we've become the magnet now for all of that solid waste. And as I'm sure everybody knows, Casella is trying to put a completely unneeded landfill in a pristine area up north, and to import more and more solid waste, these trucks driving up from the Massachusetts border and dumping all of this waste, municipal solid waste, into our kind of pristine environment, and all of the potential environmental and health impacts that would come from that. So we've had this extraordinary kind of coalition of legislators on both sides of the aisle with North Country Alliance for Balanced Change, those folks that we have talked to now for a couple of years. And last year in June, they had a session where they brought together, this is where I met Dave Rochefort from Littleton. He's running for state senate up in District 1. And there were other Republicans and Democrats there. And it was a meeting to talk specifically about what are the 5 or so bills that we are going to introduce in the next session, right? And to identify specific bills on specific issues, to identify who the prime sponsors were going to be on those bills, and how you were going to try to develop bipartisan co-sponsorship. So it was targeted, it was bipartisan, and it was focused, right? As I said, it wasn't 10 things, it was maybe 5 things. And from those bills, we developed kind of 2 parallel strategies. First is the legislative strategy, right? So you're thinking about, as I said, who the sponsor is going to be, bipartisan co-sponsors, and really trying to reach out and build connections on both sides of the aisle. We had some extraordinary success in this last session where we actually passed a number of landfill-related bills unanimously through the Environment and Agriculture Committee. So we had a landfill moratorium bill that went through. We had a cap, 15% cap on out-of-state waste. Very bipartisan. Went through our committee, 19-0. I think we had one person who wasn't there that day, and went onto the consent calendar and passed out of the House on consent, just on a voice vote. Totally bipartisan. And then, as all good things do, it died in the Senate. But we also had a bill, one that I worked a lot on, that was about all future landfills in the state being publicly owned. And so the land would be publicly owned either by the state or a political subdivision. And if it's owned by the state, it would be operated by a private operator who would lease that business through the state. And that gives you a lot of flexibility around the Interstate Commerce Clause. You can charge different rates for different kinds of materials. You can cap out of state waste. You can do all kinds of things if the state controls it rather than a private entity. That was there was more of a partisan divide. We were lucky we had Representative Kelly Potenza on our committee, who was courageous in her advocacy on these issues. And she was the lone Republican who voted with all of the Democrats to pass that bill out of committee. So it went to the floor with an ought to pass recommendation. That was a really courageous thing to do. Went through 11-9, and to be the only Republican voting that way was a really big gesture by Kelly. But we were able to pass it through the House with, I think, 40-something Republican votes, because we really worked both sides of the aisle. We knew this wasn't going to be as bipartisan as some of our other landfill bills were. There were a number of Republicans who are completely allergic to the term public ownership, right? Regardless of what comes after that phrase just completely turned them off. But we worked really hard, having some Republican co-sponsors, making a lot of phone calls, working with folks at North Country who, some folks in this network probably reached out to legislators on the Republican side. And we knew going into that vote that we had the bipartisan coalition we needed to pass it. And in fact, the Republican leadership tried to kill that bill. The first motion on that bill was indefinite postponement, which is what we call killing a bill extra dead. And we knew that we had enough Republican support to be able to beat back their indefinite postponement motion, and we were able to pass it. And again, it went on to the Senate where it was killed. But we had a legislative strategy, right? And that involved, as I said, the sponsors, the co-sponsors, talking to people. So you've basically got a whip count when you bring it to the floor, and you know that you can get the votes to win. Running parallel to the legislative strategy has to be a public relations strategy, right? And that can be, for example, it's really important anytime public officials have town hall events or any type of public event where they're taking questions and talking to the public, they need to hear people again and again and again ask these questions. The more often they hear people say it's unacceptable for New Hampshire to be the dumping ground for solid waste from around the region at different meetings over and over again, that is really going to register with them as something they need to pay attention to. And we were able to, I'm really proud of what we were able to accomplish. We elevated this issue around solid waste to a point where not only did the union leader and the Concord Monitor, but NHPR and WMUR all did several pieces on some aspect of the out-of-state solid waste issue. Dave Rochefort and I were on WMUR on New Hampshire Business with Fred Coker twice. He invited us to come in and talk about this legislation and these issues. Dave and I had a joint, he and I became kind of a bit of a team, the bipartisan team. And that meant a lot. That's one of the reasons why Fred Coker at WMUR reached out to us, is because he liked the fact that it was a Democrat and a Republican, and that we were doing a lot of stuff publicly together, publishing op-eds together. And that made it an issue that, didn't suffer from the same kind of partisan or ideological kind of strife that a lot of legislation gets bogged down in. So we got to a point where Cindy Warmington, she cut an ad, as probably everybody saw. One of her ads this year was about solid waste. And so we elevated this issue to, it was one of the issues that all of the gubernatorial candidates at some point had to address on both the Democratic and Republican side about whether or not they would support the new landfill up in Dalton, whether or not they would take a stand against out-of-state solid waste. And we had that legislative strategy and the public relations strategy hand in hand. So every time we had a vote on something in the House, we followed that up with letters to the editor and with op-eds and with some of the other media pieces that we were able to get out there. So those two went in lockstep with each other. And it was a combination of this bipartisan group of legislators, really a core people of, a core group of just a handful of people, but people who are like Rebecca, really respected legislators can really bring in other people to support some of this legislation. So we met again this year, a similar approach. We came up with a handful of bills that we are going to put forward around leachate storage and transportation. That's become a really big issue. I put in a bill already to have a moratorium on landfill permitting until 2030. We're probably going to do the publicly owned landfill again, and we've got a couple of other bills too. And we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to have our legislative track and build our coalitions and couple that with our public relations pieces and try to push an issue that has come really far, over the line in the next session. And the last thing that I'll say is that when you are working on these issues and thinking about legislation and how to get it passed, you need to think in terms of our biennium, right? So with the first year after an election, the odd number year is a budget year, right? So anything that has to be in the budget, that is the year probably where you want to try to get that done. But very often, a lot of the issues we're talking about aren't necessarily things that have to have a place in the budget. So often in that first year, you're setting up the second year. The purpose of the bill is to create discussion, to build momentum. Sometimes it's a good opportunity for study committees. Those are good in the first year, not in the second year when people are running for re-election. And that sets you up often for legislation that you introduce in the second year of a biennium. All right, so when you're thinking about legislative strategies, be specific about what kinds of bills you want. Be specific in thinking about who can champion that on both sides of the aisle, and be specific and realistic about kind of a time frame. Is this are we going to get this passed in the first year? Probably not. In the second year, maybe. You also need to be willing to play the long game. When we see significant changes in legislation, like our colleagues who fought for years to abolish the death penalty in New Hampshire, right? I don't know how many years that took, but that took a coalition of legislators working year in and year out, refining the legislation, building a coalition, and playing the long game. And when we get significant accomplishments, it's because we are usually you can follow it back and find a legislator like Rebecca, who has been working on this issue for several years and building that coalition and building that momentum and refining legislation over the course of several terms. So that's been my experience. I'm really proud of how far in a year or so we have come with our solid waste issue concerns, and we're looking to build on that for this next year, and hopefully we'll get a legislature and a governor who is willing to help us take it to the next step and actually get some of this stuff passed into law.
Thank you very much, Representative Germano. That's great insights. And yeah, we look forward to helping you make progress on those and more in the future. So we're that's our two panelists. The next section of this event is a discussion for everybody to share ideas you have, and even more specifically questions for our panelists. And maybe I'll start off with a question. So I would like to see every person that gets elected be the one that is most forward-looking in addressing climate change and preparing for federal policies that will hopefully make fossil fuels more expensive to use in the long run. So I love the ideas about talking about the economic impacts. I'm concerned about the economic impacts of climate change on New Hampshire, and resilience is a really nice thing to talk about with candidates of any party. But like if there's a town event where you're asking a question, is it a bad idea to put candidates on the spot, not on a one-to-one, but to get their basic positions on climate and policy? Because what I've seen is we have some legislators who absolutely deny the science. They go to the Heartland Institute conferences to get talking points from the fossil fuel industry. They ignore our official state climate scientists and the state's climate assessment report, which is our good climate scientists in the state saying this is what we know is happening and we're headed for in the future. And I kind of want to shine a light on candidates who don't accept the science or don't agree that policy changes are needed to reduce the pollution. But do you have any suggestions on, is that just a bad idea? Is it better, to always try to meet them where they are, or is there ever a time where it's okay to show what they are to other voters so that people can, make clear decisions?
I'll take a stab at that question. There are many layers to this, right? You've got to think about your marketing strategy for what you want to get out of the interaction. If this is in a public forum and you have someone who's an incumbent and you already know what their climate stance is, that's very different than if this is a first-time candidate, no one's ever heard of them before, and you need to get them on record to figure out where they stand in terms of what would they do to address resiliency and holding polluters, in the case of Representative Germana's concerns about PFAS, holding polluters responsible for their own pollution and the cost of human health. I think that those are good questions that should be asked to get on the record for new candidates. I think when you have returning candidates, that's a little trickier because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, when folks get elected over and over again and are repeatedly in an elected position, they end up being like elephants and having a really long memory about someone who may have embarrassed them in a public forum. And you don't really want to be that bad guy for someone later on. So I would say you want to handle it a little bit delicately, but also it's important to get new candidates on record for where they stand. And we all know we are. Listen, I tell people in New Hampshire, politics is our football, man. We are so into politics. We know when someone's running, if they promise something and they don't keep that promise and they go back on that, we pay attention to that. New Hampshire is really like, we're on top of keeping track of who lied when they were campaigning. And I think that's a good thing. We're proud of that, but also we need to create a record so we can do that. So again, this is just coming from somebody who's been in those public forums and seen a candidate embarrassed and then seen them have a tough time collaborating and working later with someone who embarrassed them. This is not personal. I haven't been in this position where someone has made me say that I am a dyed-in-the-wool climate activist. I'm proud of that. But I do have a colleague from Merrimack who's on the other side of the aisle who is a real challenge to work with, attends Heartland Institute conferences and has a tough time with that record when called out about it. And that's just the way it is. So you have to make that decision, but this isn't about cheap shots and points on social media. This is about holding candidates responsible for what they say they're going to do and where they say they stand. And to get that on the record, because the press needs to know and constituents need to know so they can vote appropriately.
Yeah, well, Bruce has his hand. I was going to say something, but Bruce.
Oh,
looks
go
like
ahead, go ahead, go ahead, Representative Germano, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I was just going to say, yeah, definitely the point should never be to try to embarrass someone, because that's, not going to help your cause. And there's a good chance, depending on, the district you're in, like where you are, John, it's not going to, that candidate probably isn't relying on your vote, or the vote environmentalists anyway, right? So it's important to know that. I would just say that in a case like that, without trying to embarrass people or score points, is if you're in a public forum, what I would say is, in a sense, be mindful that your audience is the public when you ask that question, and not as much actually the candidate. I think about this when I'm asking questions in committee, that first of all, I like to not ask a question if I don't think I know what the answer is already, but you're asking it for a larger purpose most of the time, to make a point, right? And the question about economic impact, right? I mean, to ask especially someone who's already in office, a question that is framed in terms of, look, this is impacting people in your community in a variety of ways, right? And to kind of name those impacts. And again, you're speaking more than to kind of the audience than you are to the candidate, to get them to think about coming back to the economic, the pocketbook issues involved in environmental issues. So that would be kind of my recommendation, is remember who your audience is when you're asking those questions. And if you want that candidate to listen, the other people in the public audience are the ones who really need to hear your message. And the candidate needs to see that.
Yeah, thank you. Bruce, and then Jim. Thank you.
So I have two questions, but I don't mind asking this stupid question, but the out-of-state dumping, what is the attraction for New Hampshire? Is it tipping fees? Is it a legislative bottleneck that we've caught ourselves in? What is stopping us from just saying no more out-of-state fees, dumping?
The biggest reason is, since our landfills are, for the most part, privately owned. We have several that are publicly owned. But for the privately owned landfills, there's the Interstate Commerce Clause. And the state cannot say that those private companies can't take trash from out of state. There is an argument that's could perhaps be tested that says that we should at least try to do that. But that's the answer that you get. And the other issue too is that there are other states around us who just, for example, mattresses and things like carpets that are just rich in PFAS. And Massachusetts, you can't landfill those things there. And we don't have any restrictions on that. And we also, it's a lot easier to site a landfill in New Hampshire than it is in other states, because other states have, taken seriously concerns about contamination of water. So it's those kind of two issues. One, the concern about the Interstate Commerce Clause, and two, our landfill siting regulations are much weaker than other states.
May I just have a quick follow-up, John? Because we did pass PFAS legislation last session, which I thought, covered things like carpeting, but that may not be the same issue, Representative, in terms of trying to keep that out of the state.
We have taken a first step in the direction of saying that there are certain products with added, and I forget the exact wording, but yes, we have taken a step in that direction. But that doesn't involve waste. That has to do with products that are sold in the state, but no one's inspecting waste to see what's in it. So it doesn't apply to the solid waste that's coming into the state.
I just wanted to follow up. I think there is a third point. I know you have to run, Nick, but In terms of lobbying, Casella has a very strong lobby in New Hampshire. They pay $60,000 a year to a lobbying firm to represent them. And some of these things that they're asking for are basically complete stays on DES rules. There really is no coordinated anti-lobby by the AG's office or DES. So, watch out on the lobbying side. Lobbyists are required to register. You can Google it. It's available on the Secretary of State's website. You can see who the lobbyists are and who they represent. And this is fairly significant in New Hampshire when it comes to waste.
Jim there?
John, I have a question. Oh, Bruce also has got his hand
Well,
up.
so we have a stop at 6:30 with the representatives, and so
Oh,
did Jim
both representatives? Okay.
get his question asked? And then I think we need to let them go.
Can I ask my question, John?
If well, we're at time.
Oh, at time. Okay, sorry. I'll talk to Nick later.
And we'll have more discussion after this, but this session, this part of the night, sorry about all the Zoom problems. I tried to have a half an hour for this. But,
no problem.
I want to thank both the representatives for talking with us tonight. This was really informative, interesting, and I'm honored that I was part of an event where state representatives would come and join us. So thank you so much for your insights, and we're going to do everything we can to support climate candidates this session.
Absolutely. I'll second that.
Thank you for all of your good work with the New Hampshire Network. It matters. It really does. Keep showing up, keep bird dogging, keep working for our future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for being here.
And don't let anybody else leave because we have, I think, why don't we go finish these questions that we have now, and maybe we can each answer them for each other. And then we have a little practice exercise where we're going to pair off into a break room and practice asking a candidate climate question with each other, and then come back and see how it went. So thank you so much. And so Jim, did you want to ask your question? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll ask you anyway. It may not be relevant. I'm by the way, I'm running for the state rep, District 16 in Cheshire County. So my question was, can the recent IRA or Inflation Reduction Act funding and policies kind of leverage opportunities for more climate legislation? Because I know New Hampshire, I've been here 45 years. If there's money involved, they might go along with some things. So the question is, can we leverage that, assuming that it continues after the presidential election?
Yes, the Department of Environmental Services is working on the, climate action plan, and they did agree to use the $3 million non-competitive grant to write up a plan. The next phase they just delayed, and so there's a lot of money that we can competitively apply for grants to do lots of really good things. And if we don't get it, other states are going to. So I would think that anybody in the state legislature wouldn't just snub their nose at that money. Representative Williams is still here. Would you like to answer, or would you like to?
Yeah, I think you're right. DES is working on it. Also, Department of Energy has the ability to work on it, but has been a little bit of a slow start, mostly for political reasons. But that could change depending on the outcome of the election.
Thanks.
Yeah, for some interesting reading, read about the State Policy Network funded by the Koch Network, and the Josiah Bartlett Center is the New Hampshire node of the Koch's State Policy Network. They have different ideas about what the government is there for, and ties to the Kochs directly also. So it really matters who gets elected, what the fundamental direction of the state is. So leave it at that. Reimar, did you have something to say?
I did, and Susan also had raised her hand. As long as Representative McWilliams is still here, I had a couple of questions about about the whys behind some of this. I was very interested that you mentioned that it's hard to get climate donations or donations specifically for climate, champions, and or if that's the spearhead that one uses, it's hard to get the desired outcome. And I'm wondering whether that's because whether you have any ideas about whether that's because people feel like it's kind of a hopeless situation, whereas with some of the other more immediate issues that people feel like they could have an impact more directly. And I don't know, I'm just wondering why, and whether you have any speculations about why that might be.
I think you're probably on to something in terms of our news cycles and the way that we tend to avoid addressing each of these individual catastrophes as part of a larger shift. Right, we'll talk about an individual hurricane or two hurricanes back to back hitting Florida, but we're not actually talking about wildfires all over Canada and California at the same exact time and climate refugees moving to New England. We're having a huge influx. We're expecting tens of thousands in the next 5 years in New England, climate refugees from other parts of the US only. So we're not talking about it. It's not in the news. It's just kind of happening. And so I don't think it's at the front of mind. I think people tend to think of splashy, sexy things, or at least things that can be encapsulated and said, well, fire Edelblue, that'll solve our public education issues. Like climate is much more complex. And for some people, their eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, that's an engineering challenge. It's really complicated. But in terms of donations, maybe it's just not sexy. I don't know how to make it sexy, but it's a big deal. And if you don't have a stable climate, public education isn't going to matter.
Funny, I always think of it as really sexy, but I guess, different tastes for different people. Susan, did you have a question?
Well, just generally, what are the good ways to open it up to people? I've been canvassing, but not doing climate because I'm just desperate to have them vote a certain way, and we are trying as New Hampshire Network to remain nonpartisan. So, I've just been saying, have you decided how you're going to vote? And most people say no, but they view that as a real friendly question. And then, but I haven't done much with climate. I don't know how to address it because either it's huge or it's, oh, you're one of those extremists, or this is so wonky, I can't deal with it. But I totally agree that the networks love the scare and don't at all acknowledge that there's an overarching thoughtful response that we could have.
Well, everything is connected, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really safe to talk about housing in New Hampshire. Everybody has a housing story about how somebody's 20-year-old kids are still living with them in the basement, and that sucks, and they never thought they'd be here, but they are, right? That's a really common theme. And I think that climate resiliency ties nicely into housing because we're talking about what are we going to do when there are more natural disasters and people who are being forced to leave because their homes are flooded or burned, or they can't find somewhere to be, or they have to move home to New Hampshire because Arizona is no longer safe. It's too hot. There's a lot going on. So I think you can kind of tie it together and talk about we need a long-term plan for housing and an influx of people to New Hampshire that we know are coming, some of whom have lived here before, some of whom have roots, some of whom have family. And they're all, in this case, it's not even about immigration. It's just about making room for our neighbors and family. And that's a resiliency thing again. So I keep bringing it back to resiliency because it's about supporting our community. And so when you say resiliency, we're talking about what is our plan to be there for the people that we care about.
Thank you.
Lena?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So my name is Lana Nurkin. I'm running for office in Belknap County District 6. And I am coming to the politics for a completely different reason, which is gun violence prevention, which is also a fun issue to talk about in New Hampshire. But I have experience working at the Energy Star program at EPA in energy efficiency for existing homes. And I wondered how I've been trying to talk about climate and then, but I'm one, and resiliency sounds like a good way to do it, but then I also, how does energy efficiency, especially for existing homes, do you think that has a connection to the dollars and cents, because we used to sell stuff as, it's a win-win situation. You save money on your energy bills and we lower our carbon footprint. I'd be interested in any language to use or any ideas on how to talk about this while I'm out there knocking on the doors.
Oh, you're right in the right place. It's a pocketbook issue, right? We come back to economics first. People are really paying attention to the fact that groceries cost 150% more this year than they did last year. And nobody's gotten 150% raise. So we're all coming at this from less money, or at least same amount of money, much more expensive everything else. So yes, make it an economics issue. Absolutely talk about energy savings. Again, this can be engineering wonky, kind of technical, but just keep it simple where you can say an investment of $500 now in the low hanging fruit, right? Energy efficiency for an old home. $500 now will reap. And I think the number's 3 times, but you tell me because you worked for the energy.
Wow, that's why I need to get and are there any rebate or, what's does the state offer incentives at all?
We do. We have a very small, hardly funded at all incentives program that sells out in the first 2 weeks of January every year. It's incredibly competitive. It generally goes to landlords. I'm really sorry. That's the status. Every year I fight to fund it more. And every year I'm told we have no more dollars, even though we're giving Reggie Renewable Greenhouse Gas Initiative Fund rebates to electric ratepayers for God knows no reason at all. It's the cost of a cup of coffee every month. But we're giving rebates to thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, but we can't actually fund our energy efficiency programs for old homes because politics. So big picture, we have it. It's not really helpful. You can direct people to it. They won't get in, but it exists. And I think it's flawed on purpose. I'll just say that.
That's what I would imagine in that kind of.
Yep.
But
Yep,
I mean,
definitely talk about it's an economics argument. So talk about the payback. If you put in $100 now, you're going to get $300 worth back of savings in the first 12 months. It just makes sense. Just do it. You want to do the blower door test. You want to upgrade your faucets. You're going to want to put in some insulation and use the infrared camera to find out where your home is leaking heating and cooling. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna start talking about it again. So.
Bruce.
Glad you're doing it, Lena.
Yeah,
That's
thank you
awesome.
so much. What town are you running in?
It's Guilford, Gilmanton, and Ward 2 of Laconia. It's a little gerrymandering situation, and there's 4 incumbent Republicans. Chances aren't good, but you got to try. And so I am doing everything I can. And actually, the energy efficiency argument I could think can sell well. And in terms of, there are things you can do. We don't have to just throw our hands up and say, oh, it's too big and too complicated. And you save money on your bills. So that I'm used to talking like that from Energy Star, because that's what Energy Star was all about is, this better performance, for less money.
Yeah, that's definitely something the state representative could help do, is help the state invest more to help people insulate their homes and make them more energy.
But tell them to vote for me. It's like, I so want to get in to be able to, because it just seems so obvious that you can make progress. And so
Yeah.
It's not easy, but.
Oh, thank you for running. Bruce.
Representative McWilliams, so I live in Pittsfield, which is a poor town. And what would be some suggestions, the cheapest, most economical way for us to create some microgrids? What are the most inexpensive entry points of microgrids?
You want to look at the public infrastructure you already have in place, town hall, library. You think you have some, do you have elementary school?
We have a K through 12.
Okay, yeah. So you already have some existing infrastructure. So you're looking at creating a dedicated loop just to keep that online. And there are grants available because it would be on the municipal side. So you'd be looking to apply for some dedicated grant funding to microgrid and backup, probably backup battery. You want to do an alternative to a generator. So the Fed has quite a bit of money available for that sort of application for your existing municipal services.
Thank you.
That sounds like a great topic for the Energy Working Group.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so I promised a breakout room and we're running out of time. So I think if it's okay with everybody, make it 6 minutes. I'll try to put you in pairs. So up 17, 16. Uh-oh, maybe this was a bad idea. This is just, you'll be with somebody, practice asking a climate question, and then we'll share a little bit about how it went. And then Susan has a couple really good resources and we'll wrap it up. So let's see if I can do this really quickly. Auto close in 6 minutes. Countdown 10 seconds. They really don't make it easy to do this. Okay, we'll see how it goes. If you're alone, just pop back out into the main room, and I'll put into chat a sample question.
Hello, no one in my meeting room.
Okay, Jim. Well, let's talk. I was afraid that might happen. I guess we might have just lost a couple of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so my idea of a question apparently is a little too on the nose, unless it's a new candidate in a public forum. I still kind of want to know. I think a lot of voters care about climate and assume that legislators are planning to do something about the problem, and nobody actually just finds out because they're not asked in a public forum. At least in my town, there's not a lot of communication about the climate issue, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get everybody together and talk. So do you want to practice that? Well, you're running, so what are you hearing? Have you ever heard a climate question?
Well, I did some work with federal funding for the Lake District, New Hampshire, Lake Sunapee District area, and we had climate work there, and we needed to bring Republicans and Democrats together at that time. So the question we posed, this was a year-long project here, Project Sunapee area, is just at forums is we asked her, what have you noticed about the weather? What have you observed? Things are different. We never used the word climate. He said, what do you think? And then when people like the road agent stands up and says, this is different, and he's been there for 30 years, all of a sudden the Republicans are listening. There was no division. We didn't even touch the word climate change for at least 6 months. And then they say, well, things are changing. We're not going to climate changing, but things are changing. We're going to do something. And then we worked on the primary issue of kind of resilience first, how they developed. The lake was getting polluted from the runoff, things like that, and things that they cared about. How does that climate issues impacting Lake Sunapee where they want it nice and clean? You see what I mean? So that's how I would work. But
Without saying climate.
yeah, we just weather, severe weather changes. What do you want to do about it? Well, we got to do something. And so first is adaptation, like more culverts, things like that. Then we move on to, well, what can we do to help reduce the future? So you got to get in the door first. The key is get them in the door.
Yeah. See, I had a whole career in a cubicle working for giant computer corporations, perfectly happy not dealing with people. It was just the zeros and ones for 30 years. And I'm here because I read a lot of science. And if everybody knew what I have learned based on major scientific reports, they'd be screaming for solutions. And my approach is just too direct. I think one-to-one, I obviously don't challenge people at all. I try to find out where they are and move them one step forward and let them know that I'm concerned about it and why. But I don't try to put them on the spot. But approaching an election, and I've seen the state go in the wrong direction a couple times in a row as far as being able to really make good progress. I think out of frustration have decided to try to do some different things, like hold Representative Notter publicly accountable, which I have tried to work with her for 7 years. So it's not like she wants to have a relationship to talk about this stuff. She doesn't want to talk about climate change at all. But so for the individual representatives other than her in particular, I continue to not try to put them on the spot.
I think that's wise, my experience. I've been doing a lot of canvassing, and you got to listen when they talk.
Definitely, yeah. I was hoping, well, hopefully people will watch the recordings. I'd like people to bring the climate issue, even if they don't say climate, to their candidates so that they have reason to do something about it if they get elected. Sarah, are you there? Would you like to practice?
I am here. I've just gotten home and I've been able to listen just a bit, but I sure appreciate what you're doing.
Well, you're in the good room here. We got Representative McWilliams and candidate Gruber, and so
Exactly. I work with NCABC against the Dalton landfill and for better waste management policies in general.
oh, terrific! Thank you.
Great. I had a chance to work on shutting down the incinerator in Claremont with the Working on Waste group over the years.
Yes,
We got
John Tuttle.
yeah, we got US. Oh yeah, Tuttle. Yes, we worked together. We got some USDA funding, rural development, to help develop an alternative solid waste recycling program that would compete with what the incinerator does. So when they shut down, there was competition. They basically eventually closed it.
Yeah, well, you've been at it a long time then.
Yeah, long time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful. Our work is relatively new compared to that, but we're hard at it, and we appreciate all the initiatives that are under the New Hampshire Network umbrella. It's quite astounding.
Citizens doing what they can to support the people that are brave enough to try to win elections and have the energy to go to a lot of meetings and put in a lot of work, and we appreciate all that you do too.
Thank you.
How did it go?
How did it? Are you're speaking to me, to Sarah?
No, just the
Oh, yeah. To the groups have come back. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll speak up. I don't have my camera on, but I know John very well. How are you doing? And thank you for doing this. And I want to thank Rebecca too, because this is helpful. I'm going to go to some candidate forums in the next few weeks. And this issue of not embarrassing candidates versus getting them to listen about taking climate change seriously is a knife edge that I have to think about. And I did have some practice with Mark just now using the idea of the microgrid and a personal story about when the power goes out and it's raining cats and dogs, the basement starts to flood and I can't pump the water out and so on. So thank you for doing this. And I thought it went very well.
Oh, that's a wonderful way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Roger. Or hand it to Susan, actually, who, do you have things to say? We might not have screen sharing, but maybe some network wrap-up events upcoming and that kind of thing?
Yeah, actually, I think I have screen sharing. So, yep, here it is. Let me do it, but let me just
Yep.
say really quickly that all this is going to be online. So you can see it. A lot of the things I'm going to say are links that don't mean that much. But there are media opportunities. WMUR Sundays at 10:30 have conversations with the candidates. So if you, but that's going to be probably not your town candidates, probably more executive council. And this Sunday, you will see the interview with Chris Pappas, but you can attend the Pappas taping on Thursday. And I don't think you can remember all this stuff. So I would say go to story ideas at WMUR.com and ask them, how can I attend the taping on Thursday, or submit your questions. And so that's every week. And HPR is going to have candidate forums October 18, 20, 28. But again, ask questions that you want the audience to hear, as well as, what is the one climate thing that we could do, or the 3 climate things we could do that would help with some of this extravagant weather. And, let's roll up our sleeves. What should we do? There are meet the candidate events happening throughout the state. So again, go to the GOP or the Democrat web pages, and that is where you can see events coming up. Okay. Is there a forum in your town? Ask your town officials. There perhaps actually is one. If not, it's not totally too late to have one, because all the, looks like Jim is willing, and Lena. The League of Women Voters, if you email them, lwvnewhampshire@gmail.com, they have a really good booklet that tells you what to do. Get some help, get your town hall, your faith group, your community center to help set up your own forum. I think that would be hugely useful and a service to your town. Questions to ask. We already have heard great ideas about that, especially values the world we leave our children, our beautiful New Hampshire winters. Though there's some good ones. More questions. I'm going to skip that. Right now, you're hearing how astonishingly, amazingly close so many elections are. So it will come down to who votes. So we really got to get out the vote, canvass, phone bank, postcard, mobilize, whoever you talk to. If they seem sympathetic, say, and could you turn around and say this to your friends, to another 3 people, and have them say it to another 3 people. And the big thing to say is, start at the bottom of the ticket, or make sure you fill out the bottom of the ticket. When it says vote for not more than 3, guess what? That means you vote for 3. You get to vote for all 3. If you don't vote for all 3, then mathematically the other guys have an advantage. So that is a real huge issue in voting. Here is a very specialized message, spreading the word vote without fear. There are people in this state who are afraid that a spouse or some other person is watching how they vote. And so you're able to say it's private, it's between you and the ballot box. You don't need to tell anyone else. And it's actually being suggested that you use sticky notes and put them out in the laundromat, the grocery store, have a little stealth campaign, the library, and toilet stalls. Vote November 5, vote for the environment. Don't worry that your vote, anyone will know your vote. It is private. And Fresh Starts Registry has some other ideas about that. November 5th, hold a sign at the polls for the candidates you support, or make a giant sign that looks like the ballot, showing actually which boxes to check, and show that you don't skip a box and you make sure you do the boxes at the bottom. Environmental Voter Project, you can get online and find them, and they have had a really huge success at making teeny but differences that count by just simply telling environmentally engaged people who are not voting in the numbers that you think they would, just simply everyone around you is voting, so you should vote too. So that's some good training. Not too late to do that. That is not yet happening in New Hampshire, but you can make a difference in other states. And I believe there will be some phone banking in New Hampshire. We are still sending out postcards to Guilford, Gilmanton, and parts of Laconia, among other places. And it says our New Hampshire environment's on the ballot. And then you can just list what are the issues that you want to put down, that, you know, there's PFAS in our water or lead, or that we want our children to know and love New Hampshire winters like we did. So whatever you want, if you're interested, just email that you want postcards, newhampshirenetwork@gmail.com. We've sent out 4,680 and we've got 320 to go. So yay, everyone, for that. Upcoming presentations in November, Tom Irwin and others will be talking about bringing lawsuits against fossil fuel actors, legal strategies to reverse the direction we're going in. And in December, how discarded clothes impact public health. It's really huge, which is stunning. And that will be December 9th with Dr. Julia DeVoy. And then we ask you to join our efforts. We have weekly newsletters from Bruce, who's on this call, legislative spreadsheets to see what are the bills that we think are of concern. And we talk to legislators to find out when. And then we have working groups. Energy is meeting this Thursday to talk about direct pay, how nonprofits can take advantage of monetary benefits, even if they're not going to get a tax benefit. Plastics meets every 2 weeks. Climate, John runs, and there'll be an environment meeting October 23rd. And we've got our website where you can see past events, and this will be posted, calendar of events in New Hampshire, actions you can take, and that's where you can also find the Zoom link, time, date, and agenda for our working groups. I hope I kept it. Oh, and plastics also has a lot of their own media, www.10towns.org. They are formidable. They're 10 Towns, 10 Actions toolkit of ideas that you can do in your local community. Don't wait for Concord, although we're working with them more now. But that resource has now been viewed in 70 countries. So we're on the map. New Hampshire Network, that's who we are. Please vote and ask everyone else you know to vote. See if you can have some civil and useful conversations. Thank you for being here. Did I make time?
Thank you for joining us, everybody. We really appreciate it, and have a great evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
next time.
Very nice.